right, so in our first session, we talked a bit about some of the functionalities of BPM. We also discussed what business process management is. And today we're going to be looking at BPM for Sage, which is the tool that we use to accomplish our business process management solutions. All right. So this is our login page. So as we can see, it's a web application. And what this means is we could make this a public IP for the server, and then users could have access from outside of the system. Also, if we do make it a public website, we can also then set up mobile functionality so that users can actually approve documents from their mobile devices using the BPM for Sage mobile app. Right, so BPM also takes multiple authentication methods. For this demo environment, we're just using normal logins with a username and a password, but it can also take Windows authentication, for example. All right. So I'm going to start off just by logging in with a user. In my demo environment, this user is the requester for finance department. Right, so BPM is role driven, and what that means is that any documents that gets assigned to specific users actually gets assigned to specific roles. And what that means is if a document goes from a requester to an approver, for example, it actually gets assigned to the role that's assigned to that approval role. So if someone were to leave, we wouldn't need to set up a new user with all the same security and everything as the previous user. We can just assign the new role or the old role to the new user, and then the new user will have access, the same access as the previous user. All right. So this is BPM's homepage. We can see there's a bit of information on here, and I just want to cover some of the basic functionality in BPM. So at the top, we've got all our menus, and all these menus and all these menu items has got full security matrices as well that can be set up. So you can have specific users can only have access to certain items, as well as in processes. When we look at processes, BPM is also, you can have certain users linked or certain roles linked to certain processes, and that would enable a user to have access to those processes. So one of the functionalities that BPM also has is it's called time management. And this is basically where we delegate our approval to someone else in the organization. So let's say, for example, I'm going on leave. I can come into the system, I can capture my leave in the system, say when I'm from what time until and what date, up until what time and what date, and the system will automatically give the delegated user access to my documents during that time period. So when we look at our home screen in BPM, we can see here that time management currently is off, but if it was on, it would have indicated it as on, and it shows us how many documents are we acting as a stand-in for someone, and how many documents were sent to stand in for someone. So what we also have is our inbox. So these are all documents that require action. We've got ad hoc documents. I'll discuss ad hoc a little bit later when we start processing. And then we've got collections, and this is for our AP recons and payment batches and vendor rotation and so on and so forth. Right. For today's session, though, we're purely going to look at a purchasing process with supplier CSD integration, which is the centralized supplier database from Treasury. We're going to be looking at that for today's example. Right, so let's start off. We'll say new. And first of all, we'll see this user's got access to capture these processes, and we're going to be focusing on the purchase requisition. Before we go into the process itself, I just want to show you what the process looks like. It is quite a big process, but I feel it is a actual world example of what processes would look like in a working environment. So one thing to remember about BPM is all the processes are customizable, where it works basically like a flow chart. It shows us where documents should route based on certain rules. So in our example, for example, it starts off with a requester, then it checks what the transaction type is. Is it a tender document? Is it an emergency request? Or is it a normal request? For our demo today, we're only going to be looking at normal requests. So we're just going to follow the route quickly for the normal request so that you can see and know what to expect, where the document should go based off our capturing. Right, so we're logged in at this first step, the requester. That's where we're going to start it off. The system here has got a system rule where it checks what type of document this is. And these checks, all these diamonds are checks. And these checks are all based off of a SQL query that we execute to return where this should route. So that means we can check for multiple things. We can check for transaction types. We can check for budgets. We can do calculations and do a check based on that calculation. So for example, we can look at approval limits. For example, here at the end, we've got a 30,000 Rand limit and a 100,000 Rand limit. And we've got multiple rules that we can set up like that. So for us, it's going to start off with a requester, go to a transaction type. In our case, it's going to be a normal transaction. It's going to check what's the level of the approver. Are they a HOD or lower? If they are lower than an HOD, it should go to the HOD for approval. If it was the HOD that was capturing, obviously it should skip that HOD's approval. All right, but in our case, it's below HOD, so it's going to go to HOD. Then our next one is whether this is a CSD request, which is a vendor rotation, or if it's just a normal request for quote. In our case, we're going to use the CSD one. It's then going to go back to, it's going to go to the buyer where they can select the commodities and the province in which they want to rotate for. Then it would go to them for the rotation part. In our case, it's not going to be IT related. It would go to the HOD and then go to finance for approval. And we're going to have it below 30,000. So the next rule is going to check whether it was a PA that captured. In our case, it won't be. And then there's a 30,000 Rand rule. It's going to be below. And then we're going to check if the supplier exists. So we check whether the supplier that was awarded the RFQ is a supplier within our ERP. And if they are not, we will then create them as a supplier first. And then after they've been created, we would then create the purchase order against that newly created supplier. What's nice about this is it frees up the ERP so that we don't have to have all the CSD suppliers within the ERP itself. We will only create suppliers if they are awarded an RFQ, for example. All right. So after this integration into the Sage environment, this document will then just send out an email notification to say that it's finished. Right, and that will be basically our process that we'll be going through today. Right. So let's start off with the process. So as I mentioned, BPM is customizable. So all the screens as well, we can actually build different fields on the screens. We can add extra tabs, we can add extra blocks. We can even build rules on top of these fields, and we can have finders that would pass information to other finders as well. Right, so the first thing to note is everything with a red asterisk are compulsory fields. So in our case, we're just going to do, this will be our live demo. And we can see our requesting role is the R1 finance role. This is R1 just abbreviated for requester. And here we've got our additional information. So we said we're going to do a CSD request, but for the example, for this session today, I'm going to check is emergency as well so that I can show you how does the error messages appear in the solution. All right. Next, we've got our supplier, which is not a required field, as the supply is going to be driven from CSD, but we do have a lot of times where clients say they want to add a preferred supplier where they would like to the buyer to get a quote from a specific supplier as well. Right. In our demo, we're not going to select this. Next, we've got our module to say whether this is GL or stock. In our case, let's say this is stock. And if I click on the item finder, this now returns all the stock items. If I were to say GL account, for example, now it will only show me the GL accounts, right? So basically this finder is passing its value to this finder, and then this finder gets calculated based off of what is in this finder, right? What we can also do is BPM also allows for record level security. So we could say the role of R1 Finance only has access to certain GL accounts. Then they will only be able to see certain GL accounts when they open the GL account finder. Right, but in our case, we're just going to do let's say a barrel of slime, which is a item that we sell. And next we say whether this is project related or not. And now we can say how many do we want. So let's say we're going to order 10. And our anticipated unit cost is 10 Rand. That's what we expect to pay for this. Next, the requesting user can now add on the comments tab, they can add motivations to say why are they requesting this. So I can say this is needed urgently. You can also set the document's urgency here, whether it's high, medium, or low. And this urgency can come in when we look at escalations. So BPM also has built-in escalation functionality. We could have a document set up with specific rules to say that if it is a high document and it has been approved within 2 hours, it should send out an email notification. But if it is a low urgency document, then it has 4 hours before it needs to send out an email notification. Our escalations can also be set up to not only just send out email notifications, but also to advance the document to say, if this person takes too long to approve, send it to his manager or his executive, for example, so that they can approve then on their behalf. All right. In our case, we're just going to leave it low. As the demo environment, we have not set up any escalations. Right. Next, we've got our attachments tab. And the attachments tab is actually where we would view any attachments that has been added to this document. All right. So we're going to go ahead and add an attachment. So I'm just going to open your attachments, and I'm going to browse for a specific file. And I've got a little test pin, which is a bowling pin that I use for the presentations. And I'm going to add that to this document. So the nice thing about this is this attachment has now been added to this document, and throughout its life cycle, and when it gets to approvers, those approvers can then open the document and view what is in there, whether it's an image or an email or a Word file or an Excel file. Those documents can all be uploaded and attached to the document itself. Right, and then our last step is the routing history. Right, so currently our routing history will be blank because we're starting this request now, but our routing history is basically a full audit trail. So BPM has its own built-in audit trail where it keeps track of every step and every person who has taken action on a specific document as it goes through its life cycle. We'll have a look at this a little bit later on in the process so that you can see what the routing history would look like. All right. So we think we've captured everything. We can now submit this document for approval. But remember, as I said, for our demo purposes for this webinar, we are actually going to have the is emergency tick on so that we can get an error message so that I can show you how that works. Also, once again, all the error messages in BPM is also customizable. We can build errors to be displayed based on certain fields, based on combination of fields, based on calculation of fields. We could have, for example, a warning pop up that should show if we are spending more than 10% of the stock on hand, for example. We're requesting more than 10% of our maximum quantity of our stock, for example. Right, but for this, to showcase this, I'm just going to tick the is emergency on. And as soon as I say forward, we'll get, validation failed. Please correct all validation errors before continuing. Right. So if I hover my mouse over there, I can say error. If emergency is selected, emergency date is also required. And if emergency is selected, no other options are allowed. Right. So we just tick that by accident, for example. We just want the CSD request, we fixed it, and we can then submit it. And this document will now continue to the next step in the process. Right. So as soon as this document has left our screen, it now went to the next level of approval, which is approver 1 for finance, which is this user. I can click on this user, I can view the user. We can also upload signatures, and I'll show you a bit later when we look at the actual purchase order that's been created, how do we use those signatures. So what we've done in the demo environment is we've set up the purchase order to print with the last approver's signature so that the digital signature is on there as well. All right, so we're going to log in with this user and have a look at this document that we need to approve. We can also see our document number is document number 806, right? So let's log out. So before I log in with that user, I just want to show you. So in our demo environment, we also have the email set up already. So that user would have received an email notification now to say that they've got something to action. And this is an example of it. So you can see this is our document number 806. It says this came from BPM, and it's got the attachment already attached to the email as well, so that before the user even logs in, they can have a look at all the attachments if needed. And we can also add, for example, a link to the document so that the user can log into the system from the email notification itself. All right, in our case, we're just going to log in with that user. So this user would now have received that email that says that they've got something to action in the inbox. They could go to the inbox. As you'll notice, they don't have full admin rights, so they don't have access to all the functionality. They only have these few tabs, but we're going to look at our inbox. Right. So here we can see document number 806. And before I go into this document, I'm just going to show you where this document is in the process. So a user can always check where a document is in the process by using the where am I function. And if you click on that, it will open up the process, and we can see all the steps with a blue border is where this document has been. And the step with the green border is where this document is currently at in the process. So we can see this document is at the HOD, which is correct, and we can then go and have a look at what was captured. Right, so the HOD can see this is what was requested. They can see the attachments, and they can look at the routing history, where they can see this is everything that's happened. The requester started this off. They've added a comment, a motivation, this is needed urgently, and they can then add their comments if they're happy and say, yes, we are going to approve this. Right. So just to look quickly at the document, at the options here at the bottom. So we've got reports, so we can have custom forms that will print on a specific process at a specific step. We can set this up. A good example of this is a picking slip. So a lot of times we have environments where you have a warehouse, a requester would request something out of the warehouse. Once it gets to the warehouse, they could then print a picking slip from the screen, for example, go and pick and then issue the stock. We can also add extra attachments at this stage. Once again, we've got the where am I, and then we've got a ad hoc button. Right. So the ad hoc functionality is used in processes where we are now the approver for the finance department, but let's say we were requesting laptops, for example. Me as the finance approver, the finance manager, I might not have a lot of knowledge on laptops, and I would rather want the IT department to give their input on this process. But because they're not part of my approval process, the document would usually not get to them. And that's where the ad hoc functionality comes in. We could ad hoc this document to a user that's not part of our process, our approval process, and they can give feedback on the specific request so that we can make an informed decision on whether we should approve this or not. In our case, we're just going to approve this, so we can forward this, or if there was something wrong and it needed to be fixed or it was going to be declined, we could have sent it back by using the return to originator button. But in our case, we're just going to approve this. We're happy with this. Right. So now it goes to the buyer, where they can now update commodities for the specific document. All right. So let's log in with this user. I'm going to log out. Let's log in with this user. And now I'm logged in as the buyer. I can go to my inbox and I can see I've got this document that's awaiting allocation. Right. I'm going to open it up. I can assign now a commodity that I want to use when I'm doing my rotation. In my case, I'm just going to use baking supplies. And in which province are we going to search for? For this scenario, let's just use Gauteng. Right. So in this environment, in this specific session, we're only looking at commodity and province. However, we can set up the system as well to say we want to look up until a city level or a municipality level. We even have a client that looks up until a ward level, and looks for vendors within specific wards. All right. But for us, we're just going to use province. Right. Allocations done. And we will forward this document. Right. Right, so this document has now gone into the vendor rotation quotation step, which is still with us as the buyer, which we still have access to this document. So we can just go to our inbox. Under collection, we will have our vendor rotation quotation. Right. So here we've got our document. We can't do anything with it at the moment. We'll see we've got a status indicator, and this status indicator will grow as we go through the process of doing a request for quote. And once it's filled completely and it's solid, we'll then be able to access the document. Right, so the first step is we want to do for this specific item. We can have for multiple transactions, we can do rotations all at once, but for us, we're just going to use one. We'll click on our rotate button, and it's added vendors now for us. So if we look at our item, there's our item, and these are the vendors that came out of the rotation. Right. Now, for this environment, we've set up the rotations to work off of a count of 5, but we can change this as well. We have some clients that want to rotate 10 vendors at a time, or even 2 vendors at a time. That all depends from client to client, but for us, we're just going to select these suppliers now. So these are the suppliers that pull from the CSD, and then our next step is we need to now send out RFQs to these suppliers. So I'm going to select everybody that I want to send out to, and I'm going to click on my report button because I want to print a request for quote for these suppliers. So I can then say I want to print a request for quote, and it creates a request for quote document for each supplier. Right, this is what it looks like. Let's have a look. So this is for this supplier. We can see there's a request for quote. This is from us, what the requisition number is, who requested, what's the requested date, and then they can just fill in what's the lead time for them and what's the unit cost inclusive of that for the specific item. Once again, these forms are all customizable as well. We have some clients where they want full terms and conditions on the request for quote. That's also available, but for the demo environment, we have it quite simple. So the buyer can now take these PDFs and send them out to these suppliers, or what they can do is they can directly from the system. So if they did not print the reports, but they opted for the email option, they would have clicked on email. We'll say from which email are they sending it, what's the closing date, what's the email template that it should use, and yes, all emails is also customizable. We can change, well, you can change any email you want. We only want to get a email delivery notification if it fails to send out, and do we want to send these email attachments, and which report it should print. Then next we've got all our suppliers, and these are the emails that have been picked up from CSD that's set up on their CSD accounts. However, we can still change this if we want to mail it to a different email. This can be changed. And then we can look at attachments. Right, so remember we added the bowling pin to this document. We can also send that attachment with the RFQ to the potential suppliers. Where this comes in handy is, let's say we're purchasing a part and the buyer doesn't know what the part looks like. The originator or the requester could have added a photo of the part, and the buyer can then send that photo to the suppliers as well as along with the RFQ, right? And we can add details like terms and comments, right? We're not going to send out an email, but we simulated it now. All right. So the next step now is that the suppliers would come back with their request for quotes with their quoted prices. And it is now the buyer's function to go and add these costs per supplier. All right, so next step is we want to add the vendor costs. Right. So the system opens up. We give costs. For example, let's say the supplier quoted us 10, and they had a lead time of they can only supply next week Friday. The supplier quoted us 11, and they've got a lead time of they can deliver next week Tuesday. And the other suppliers only quoted but did not give lead times, for example, right? So we can add our vendor costs. And then as soon as we add our vendor costs, the system then calculates a score based off how we set this up. So this specific system is set up with the 80-20 split, and we look at the CSD's equity ratings together with price to get a ranking on all of these suppliers. All right. So after we've added our supplier costs for all the suppliers, we can now do our vendor selection where we actually award the RFQ. So let's do the vendor selection. So the system will automatically prompt me for the green one is the one that the system is ranked first. So this supplier should be awarded, but you are allowed to select a different supplier. However, if we do select a different supplier, the system will prompt us to give a motivation why a different supplier was selected than the top ranked one. In our case, we're just going to go with the top ranked one. Right? And as we can see, this document has now been gone full circle. We've done the full RFQ cycle. And if we go back to a transaction, this document is now able to process. So once we click on that, it'll open up the document again, but now with the supplier that was awarded loaded, as well as the costs that was allocated. Right, so here we can now say rotation complete, and we can approve this document. So this document now goes to the HOD, goes to the HOD step. In our case, it is the A1 finance user. So we're going to log in and have a look at that document now. So let's log in with that user again. Right. So that user can then log in, have a look at their document that they need to approve. And from here, if there was any non-compliance, as I mentioned, where we didn't select the top ranked supplier, this will now display the reason that the buyer has selected on the reason for non-compliance. Since we don't have any, this HOD will just approve the document, and it would then go to the head of finance. In our case, it's the same user, so they'll just receive the document again, and they can approve it again. All right. So now it's gone to the integration step. So this is where BPM now integrates into the ERP. And a lot of people always ask, is it a live integration? Yes, it is, and also no, it isn't. It is live, as in as soon as we send it for integration, it's going to sit in a queue to integrate. However, the queue only gets cleaned every 1 minute. So every 1 minute integrations go into the ERP. So it's live, but every 1 minute it's live. That's why we usually explain it. All right. So let's give it a minute to integrate. And while we're waiting, let's log in as the admin user to see how far that document is going. Let's see if it has integrated yet. It might have already integrated. Right, so let's go search for that transaction. We know it was document number 806. All right, and yes, it has integrated. We have our integration status. It is duplicated because it shows every integration that happened. So we can see it integrated once and created a supplier for us. And then it integrated again and created a purchase order for us. All right. So as part of this process, at the end step, what we actually do is we send out a purchase order, a signed purchase order to the supplier. But this can also be set up to send to the buyer so that they can send out. And this is basically what it looks like. It will say the EVO transaction was created for document POS 806. This is the transaction, the supplier that was created, as well as the purchase order that was created. And if we open up this purchase order, we can see we've got our purchase order with our purchase order number, with the supplier information, and the last approver's signature is already added onto this purchase order. We can see it's authorized by this person with their email signature. All right, so that's basically a purchasing process from start to finish with CSD integration. And I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you, everyone.